Susan Smith was 23 years old, a young mother living in Union, South Carolina, when the story that would horrify the entire nation began on the night of October 25th, 1994. She was a petite woman with a soft southern voice, the kind of person who looked like she belonged on the cover of a family magazine. That appearance would become the foundation of one of the most manipulative lies in modern American crime history. That evening, Susan called 911 in a state of hysterical panic. Through sobs, she told the operator that a mysterious black man had hijacked her car at a traffic light and driven off with her 2 children still inside. Her sons were 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander. She described the alleged carjacker in vague terms and begged the police to find her babies. Within hours, the quiet town of Union turned into the center of a national manhunt. For 9 straight days, the media broadcast Susan's tearful press conferences across the country. Viewers saw her clutching stuffed animals, pleading directly into cameras for the safe return of her boys. The FBI joined the search. Politicians expressed sympathy. Churches held vigils. Strangers mailed her money, flowers, and letters of support. The story seemed painfully familiar. An innocent mother, devastated by a terrible crime. But from the beginning, something didn't sit right with investigators. The alleged carjacking took place at a deserted rural intersection near John D. Long Lake. Witnesses reported seeing no stranger that night. No tire marks suggested a violent struggle. Susan's statements shifted slightly with each retelling, and the timing was suspicious. Just days before, she had been involved in a complicated relationship with a wealthy man who had made it clear he did not want children in his life. To Susan, this relationship represented a possible escape from financial stress, failed marriages, and the heavy responsibility of motherhood. Behind closed doors, detectives quietly began to doubt the kidnapping story. As public support continued to grow, investigators intensified their pressure. They questioned Susan repeatedly, sometimes for hours at a time. They examined her financial records, they retraced her route that night, and, most importantly, they analyzed her behavior. Grief, they knew, does not follow a script, but deception often does. On November 3rd, 1994, 9 days after her sons vanished, Susan Smith finally broke. She was brought in for yet another interrogation. Exhausted, cornered by inconsistencies in her own story, she confessed. There was no carjacker, no stranger, no kidnapping. That night, Susan had driven to John D. Long Lake with her 2 sons strapped into their car seats. She rolled the car into the water. As it slowly sank, Michael and Alex were trapped inside. Susan stood on the shore and watched. Michael, the older boy, had asked from the back seat, "Mommy, can you get me?" The water was already rising. She did not answer. When divers recovered the car days later, they found both children still buckled into their seats. Michael's lungs were filled with lake water. Alex had drowned without a sound. Their deaths were slow, silent, and completely preventable. The nation reacted with shock and fury. The woman who had been embraced as a grieving mother was now revealed as their killer. Vigils turned into protests. Sympathy turned into outrage. Many felt personally betrayed after pouring their emotions into the search for the boys. At trial in 1995, prosecutors laid out a chilling motive. Susan Smith wanted a fresh start, free of children, free of financial pressure, free to pursue a man who had made it clear that 2 small sons did not fit into his vision of the future. To the jury, it wasn't depression that drove her, it was convenience. The defense argued that Susan was mentally unstable, emotionally fragile, and suffering from severe depression. They pointed to her traumatic childhood, her history of sexual abuse, and her past suicide attempts. They presented her as a deeply broken woman who had reached a psychological breaking point. But the jury was unmoved. Susan Smith was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 30 years. The judge ruled that the crime showed extreme cruelty and complete disregard for human life, especially the lives of her own children. In prison, Susan became one of the most notorious inmates in the country. Over the years, she was disciplined for multiple incidents, including drug possession and sexual relationships with prison guards. Her behavior only reinforced public perception of her as manipulative and unrepentant. In interviews from behind bars, Susan has given conflicting accounts of her mental state at the time of the murders. Sometimes she speaks of overwhelming despair. Other times, she suggests she thought her children would be better off without her. But to many, these explanations ring hollow. The image that persists is not one of confusion, but of calculation. The victims, Michael and Alexander Smith, are remembered today not as footnotes in their mother's story, but as the true center of this tragedy. Michael loved trucks and toy cars. Alex was just beginning to walk. Their lives ended before they ever had a chance to grow into the people they might have become. The Susan Smith case forced America to confront an impossible question. How could a mother deliberately murder the very children she once carried, protected, and nurtured? It shattered the comforting assumption that maternal instinct is always stronger than selfish desire. And it revealed how easily appearances can deceive, how grief can be performed, how trust can be weaponized, and how evil doesn't always arrive with a warning. Today, Susan Smith remains behind bars in South Carolina, where she will not be eligible for parole until at least 2024. Whether she will ever be released is uncertain. What is certain is that the night of October 25th, 1994, will forever remain one of the darkest chapters in the history of American crime. 2 little boys went into a lake. Only one person drove the car there, and she was their mother. Andrea Yates lived in Houston, Texas, in a small suburban home that looked no different from thousands of others across America. Neatly trimmed lawn, quiet street, 5 children inside. To neighbors, she seemed like a shy, orderly, deeply religious mother devoted to her family. What they could not see was the storm of untreated psychosis growing behind the walls of that house. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Andrea Yates drowned all 5 of her children in the family bathtub. The children were 7-year-old Noah, 5-year-old John, 3-year-old Paul, 2-year-old Luke, and 6-month-old Mary. By the time their father, Rusty Yates, left for work that morning, 4 of them were alive. By the time he returned home, none of them were. Andrea had a long, medically documented history of severe mental illness. She had been hospitalized multiple times for postpartum psychosis, major depression with psychotic features, and suicidal behavior. After the birth of her youngest child, Mary, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking coherently. She became obsessed with religious guilt and the belief that she was a bad mother who was corrupting her children. Doctors warned that Andrea should not have more children. They warned that she needed constant supervision. They warned that another pregnancy could be catastrophic. Those warnings were ignored. On the morning of the killings, Andrea waited until Rusty left for work. She then methodically filled the bathtub with water. One by one, she carried her children into the bathroom. She held each child underwater until they stopped moving. She placed their bodies on the bed. When Noah, the oldest, tried to run, she chased him through the house and forced him into the tub last. After it was over, Andrea called the police. Then she called her husband. When officers arrived, they found the children lined up on the bed like they were asleep. Andrea was calm, detached. She told investigators that she had killed them to save their souls. She believed Satan was inside them. She believed she was preventing them from growing up to be sinful. The nation was stunned. At first, public opinion was divided. Some saw Andrea as a monster who methodically murdered her children. Others saw a profoundly broken woman, abandoned by a mental health system that failed to stop the inevitable. The trial began in 2002 and immediately became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in American history. The prosecution argued that Andrea knew right from wrong. They pointed to her calm phone calls, her orderly placement of the bodies, and her request for police afterward as proof of awareness. The defense argued that Andrea was legally insane. They presented years of medical records documenting severe postpartum psychosis. They described hallucinations, suicidal urges, and repeated hospitalizations. They argued that she did not understand the moral reality of what she had done. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The courtroom erupted. Some families of the victims wept with relief. Others were devastated, believing that a mentally ill woman had been punished instead of treated. Then, in 2006, everything changed. It was discovered that one of the prosecution's key expert witnesses had given false testimony. Based on that revelation, Andrea's conviction was overturned. She was granted a new trial. The second trial, held in 2006, reached the opposite conclusion. This time, the jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state psychiatric hospital rather than prison. The legal system, 5 years later, acknowledged what many doctors had said from the beginning. Andrea Yates was suffering from one of the most severe cases of postpartum psychosis ever documented. Her husband, Rusty Yates, later admitted that he ignored medical advice and left Andrea alone with their children, despite repeated warnings from doctors that she should never be unsupervised. His public image shifted dramatically over time, from grieving father to controversial figure, criticized for reckless decisions. Andrea remains confined today in a high-security mental health facility in Texas. She is heavily medicated. She participates in structured treatment. She will never be released without strict judicial review. But the real tragedy lies not in the legal outcome. It lies in the 5 small lives that ended in a quiet suburban bathroom. Noah loved dinosaurs. John loved helping his father with tools. Paul followed his older brothers everywhere. Luke was just learning to speak. Mary had not yet learned to crawl. None of them ever stood a chance. The Andrea Yates case changed how America views postpartum mental illness. Hospitals revised protocols. Doctors became more aggressive about monitoring at-risk mothers. Families became more aware that postpartum psychosis is not sadness. It is a life-threatening psychiatric emergency. Yet even with those changes, the case continues to haunt the national conscience. Was Andrea a loving mother overtaken by disease, or a calculating killer hiding behind illness? Could this tragedy have been prevented if the right decisions were made? Or was the outcome already sealed the moment the warning signs were ignored? There are no answers that bring comfort, only the reality that 5 children are gone forever, and their mother lives on, Not in freedom, not in prison, but in a hospital room, under constant watch, with the full weight of what she did never leaving her. Some crimes feel like acts of evil. This one feels like the slow collapse of a system meant to protect both mother and child. And everyone lost. Casey Anthony was 22 years old, a young woman living in Orlando, Florida, when her world, or at least the world she projected, began to unravel in the summer of 2008. She was a college student, a socialite, someone who seemed to be balancing the pressures of young adulthood with a carefree attitude. But the reality beneath the surface would soon shock the nation and spark one of the most publicized trials of the century. Her daughter, Kaylee Anthony, was just 2 years old. By all accounts, she was a bright, cheerful child, full of life and curiosity. She had been living with her grandmother, Cindy Anthony, in the months leading up to her disappearance. Casey had been struggling with work, school, and a rocky romantic life. There were reports that she had shown signs of irresponsibility and immaturity, but nothing that could have predicted the horror that would unfold. On July 15, 2008, Casey reported her daughter missing. By then, Kaylee had already been missing for 31 days. Casey claimed she had last seen her daughter playing in the family yard before leaving to go to a party. She said that an unknown babysitter had disappeared with the child. From the outset, her story was riddled with inconsistencies. Authorities immediately became suspicious. Casey's mother, Cindy, described a chaotic household and noted that Casey often lied about simple matters. Casey had called the police at least once before claiming that Kaylee was missing, but had given conflicting details about the timeline and who had last cared for her. Friends reported that Casey was seen partying and enjoying life in the weeks her daughter was allegedly missing. On December 11, 2008, the authorities found Kaylee's remains in a wooded area near the Anthony family home. She had been dead for months. The cause of death was ruled as homicide by undetermined means, which only intensified the speculation and media frenzy. Casey Anthony's trial began in May 2011. The prosecution painted a portrait of a young mother who had grown impatient with her child and deliberately killed her to free herself from parental responsibilities. They presented forensic evidence suggesting that Kaylee may have been chloroformed and that her body had been transported and disposed of near the woods by Casey. They pointed to Casey's repeated lies to law enforcement and her mother as evidence of consciousness of guilt. They also described behavior that shocked the public: partying, drinking, and seeming carefree while her daughter's body was missing. The defense, however, argued a different story. They portrayed Casey as a young woman whose child had accidentally drowned in the family pool. They suggested that Casey's father, George Anthony, discovered the body and panicked, hiding the evidence to protect the family. They emphasized Casey's troubled upbringing, mental instability, and alleged sexual abuse by her father. They argued that Casey's lies were not proof of murder, but attempts to conceal a family tragedy from the public eye. Throughout the trial, the media coverage was relentless. Casey Anthony became a household name. Talk shows, news broadcasts, and internet forums dissected every aspect of her life, often painting her as a symbol of the selfish millennial mother. Public opinion was overwhelmingly against her, and online outrage was instantaneous. The jury, after 7 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, reached a verdict on July 5, 2011. Casey Anthony was acquitted of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child abuse. She was, however, found guilty on 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. She was sentenced to 4 years in jail, with credit for time served, and was released shortly thereafter. The verdict ignited nationwide outrage. Many could not reconcile the legal acquittal with the apparent evidence of wrongdoing. Casey Anthony became the center of cultural debates about motherhood, justice, and media sensationalism. Was she a calculating killer, or a young woman overwhelmed by circumstance, compounded by a flawed family and mismanaged expectations? The truth remains murky, but the case continues to captivate, horrify, and divide audiences even today. Kaylee Anthony, meanwhile, became a symbol of innocence lost. Her brief life continues to spark conversations about child protection, parental responsibility, and the limits of the legal system in addressing moral versus legal culpability. Advocates have used her story to push for stricter child welfare laws, mandatory reporting, and more attentive policing of neglect and abuse. Even a decade later, the Casey Anthony case serves as a cautionary tale. It illustrates the complexity of human behavior, the unpredictability of maternal actions, and the tragic consequences that can arise when a child is placed in a situation of vulnerability. It challenges our assumptions about motherhood, about innocence, and about the public perception of guilt and innocence. The world may never fully understand what happened to Kaylee Anthony. We know that she died, that she was failed, and that her mother's actions, whether directly murderous or tragically negligent, changed the landscape of American true crime forever. Casey Anthony walks free, a figure of controversy and cultural obsession, while the questions surrounding that summer of 2008 linger like shadows over Florida, over justice, and over the idea of what it truly means to be a mother. Lori Vallow Daybell, a woman whose life seemed ordinary to casual observers, became one of the most infamous mothers in modern American crime history. Living in Idaho, she projected the image of a suburban mother concerned with her family's welfare. But behind closed doors, Lori's beliefs, relationships, and manipulations were dark, disturbing, and deadly. Lori had a long and complicated history. She had been married multiple times and was closely associated with apocalyptic religious groups that preached the imminent end of the world. Over the years, she became convinced that she and her children were part of a divine plan to survive Armageddon. This worldview, combined with her volatile personality, would set the stage for one of the most chilling cases in recent memory. Her 2 children, 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 17-year-old Tylee Ryan, were legally under her care in 2019. Despite Lori's outward appearance of parental concern, both children were reportedly living in chaotic, secretive, and frightening conditions. Tylee had been enrolled in school inconsistently and had vanished from public view. JJ's whereabouts were similarly shrouded in secrecy. Friends, neighbors, and extended family began noticing that the children were rarely seen, and that Lori and her new husband, Chad Daybell, were increasingly controlling and insular. By late 2019, the situation escalated into tragedy. Authorities investigating unrelated matters discovered that Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow were missing. Their last known sightings were with Lori and Chad, and multiple attempts by family members to locate the children were met with excuses, evasions, or outright lies. Lori claimed the children were staying with relatives, traveling, or otherwise engaged in activities that kept them out of sight. Suspicion grew, but no immediate evidence revealed the horrific truth. The turning point came when law enforcement executed searches at Lori and Chad's residences in Idaho, In June 2020, they discovered the remains of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, buried on Chad Daybell's property. Forensic examinations confirmed that both children had been dead for months, their deaths shrouded in mystery. The case instantly attracted national attention, due in part to the bizarre religious motivations, the secrecy, and the shocking betrayal by a mother who was expected to protect her children at all costs. Investigators pieced together a disturbing timeline. Lori and Chad had repeatedly lied to family, friends, and authorities, creating an intricate web of deceit. Evidence suggested that Lori ordered the murders of her children, believing that their deaths were necessary for spiritual salvation and in preparation for an apocalyptic future. The notion that a mother could believe killing her own children was part of a divine plan shocked prosecutors, the public, and psychologists alike. During the trial proceedings, court documents revealed extensive manipulation and premeditation. Lori had isolated her children from outside contact, ensured that no one knew their true location, and carefully constructed narratives to cover their disappearances. In addition, she had influenced Chad, an older man with his own history of occult and apocalyptic beliefs, to align with her twisted vision. Together, their dynamic created an environment of total control, secrecy, and ultimately, death. The case also highlighted failures in the system. Multiple school officials, social workers, and law enforcement personnel had interacted with Lori or her children over the years, but were misled by her fabrications. These oversights allowed Lori and Chad to carry out their plans without early intervention, resulting in a tragedy that could have been prevented with stricter oversight. In court, Lori's demeanor was calm, detached, and at times unrepentant. Experts testified that her beliefs reflected a dangerous combination of religious delusion and narcissistic personality traits. She showed no visible grief over the deaths of JJ and Tylee, further cementing the perception that her motivations were rooted in ideology rather than emotion. Her manipulation of others, coupled with her disregard for the sanctity of her children's lives, painted a chilling portrait of maternal betrayal. In July 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted on multiple counts related to the murders of her children. Chad Daybell, who played a complicit role in the deaths, was also convicted. The judge in Lori's case described her actions as calculated, cold, and deliberate, emphasizing the extraordinary breach of trust inherent in a mother who kills her own children. Sentencing reflected the severity of the crime, underscoring that the premeditated nature of the murders and the ideological justification did nothing to mitigate the moral and legal responsibility. The deaths of Tylee and JJ highlight the darkest possibilities of parental betrayal. They were removed from the world not by strangers or chance, but by the very person entrusted with their care. Friends and relatives described the children as energetic, loving, and unaware of the danger posed by their mother until it was too late. The community mourned not only the loss of life, but the betrayal of a maternal figure, a betrayal that resonates deeply because it strikes at the core of what society assumes about mothers. Beyond the courtroom, Lori Vallow Daybell's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremist beliefs, unchecked psychological instability, and systemic failures that allow children to remain vulnerable in their own homes. It serves as a grim reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that devotion can be twisted into fanaticism, and that sometimes the greatest threats come from those who claim to love us most. the Idaho case remains one of the most shocking examples in recent American history of maternal betrayal intertwined with apocalyptic ideology. It forces a confrontation with questions that are almost impossible to answer. How can love become so warped? How does belief justify murder? And how can society intervene before tragedy strikes, when the lines between devotion and delusion blur beyond recognition? Tylee and JJ are gone, their lives cut tragically short by a mother whose mind and actions were shaped by delusion, control, and extreme self-interest. The case leaves a chilling legacy for law enforcement, psychologists, and the public alike. The reminder that evil can reside where it is least expected, in the very heart of a family. Pearl Fernandez lived in Palmdale, California, a woman whose life seemed ordinary at first glance. She had 2 children, one of whom was an energetic 8-year-old boy named Gabriel Fernandez. To outsiders, Pearl might have appeared as a devoted mother trying to manage the challenges of parenthood. But beneath the surface lay a combination of neglect, rage, and cruelty so extreme that it would horrify the nation. Gabriel Fernandez's life was a daily struggle against the abuse inflicted by his mother and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre. Pearl's behavior ranged from neglect to extreme physical violence, with documented incidents stretching back years. Teachers, neighbors, and social workers noticed bruises and injuries, but despite multiple reports to Child Protective Services, Gabriel remained in the household. The system's repeated failures allowed Pearl's destructive patterns to continue unchecked. Pearl herself had a difficult upbringing. She grew up in a turbulent household, surrounded by substance abuse and domestic instability. Some psychologists later argued that her violent tendencies and poor coping mechanisms were influenced by her own childhood trauma. Yet no explanation could justify the systematic torment she inflicted on her son. By 2013, Gabriel had been subjected to horrific abuse. He was tied to furniture, beaten with belts and sticks, forced to eat cat litter, and starved. He was threatened with knives and other weapons. He was isolated from the outside world, often confined to a bedroom for hours, sometimes days without adequate food or water. Pearl would punish him for minor infractions or perceived disobedience, sometimes at random, often without warning. Neighbors reported hearing Gabriel scream and cry at night. Teachers at his school noticed his frequent absences and visible injuries. Social services visited multiple times, but Pearl and Isauro were adept at covering up the severity of the abuse. They provided false explanations for injuries, claimed Gabriel was clumsy, or blamed each other. Each missed opportunity by the system compounded the danger the boy faced. The abuse culminated on May 22, 2013. Gabriel was found unconscious, tied up, malnourished, and severely injured. Emergency responders immediately transported him to the hospital, but despite medical intervention, Gabriel died 2 days later. His death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head, with additional injuries indicating chronic abuse. The images of his battered body shocked California and the nation. The details of his suffering were so extreme that even seasoned detectives and prosecutors described it as the worst case of child abuse they had encountered in decades. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and torture. Court documents revealed a chilling pattern of premeditation and collaboration. Pearl, as the mother, had both direct and indirect responsibility. She inflicted injuries herself, failed to protect her son from Aguirre's violence, and encouraged the abuse. The prosecutors argued that Pearl's intent was clear. She either wanted Gabriel to obey her completely or to punish him for simply existing, and she was indifferent to the suffering he endured. During the trial, the court heard graphic testimony from teachers, social workers, and law enforcement officials. Medical records and photographs painted a horrifying picture of Gabriel's final months. One expert testified that Gabriel had endured severe abuse almost daily for the 2 years preceding his death. The cumulative effect of beatings, starvation, and confinement had irreversibly damaged him, both physically and psychologically, long before the fatal incident. Pearl Fernandez initially claimed that she did not realize the extent of Gabriel's injuries. She described her actions as attempts to discipline him, framing the beatings as parental discipline. This defense, however, was dismantled by evidence and witness testimony. Experts argued that no responsible parent could inflict such injuries without knowing the risk of death, particularly over a sustained period. The verdicts reflected the gravity of the crimes. Pearl Fernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Isauro Aguirre received the death penalty, which remains under appeal. The court emphasized the cruelty, duration, and deliberate nature of the abuse, noting that Gabriel's suffering was prolonged and that his mother had been a willing participant in his torment. The case sparked widespread outrage, not only because of the cruelty inflicted on Gabriel, but because it highlighted systemic failures in child protective services. Multiple reports had been made by teachers and neighbors, yet Gabriel remained in the household. Investigations revealed mismanagement, lack of follow-up, and inadequate communication between agencies. The public demanded reforms, resulting in increased oversight, stricter reporting requirements, and reforms in Los Angeles County's child welfare system. Beyond systemic lessons, the case of Pearl Fernandez serves as a stark example of maternal betrayal at its most extreme. As a mother, she was expected to provide safety, nurturing, and guidance. Instead, she became a source of terror, compounding the brutality inflicted by her boyfriend. Gabriel's brief life became a nightmare from which he could not escape. Even today, discussions of Gabriel's case are filled with disbelief and sorrow. Advocates for child welfare often cite his story to illustrate the necessity of timely intervention and the dangers of assuming parental competence. Psychologists study cases like Gabriel's to understand how cycles of abuse develop and how traumatic upbringing can shape both perpetrators and victims. Pearl Fernandez's actions shattered the fundamental trust between parent and child, leaving an indelible mark on the community, the legal system, and the national consciousness. Gabriel, a boy who should have been protected and cherished, became a tragic emblem of what happens when cruelty and neglect replace love and responsibility. His life was short, but the lessons from his death continue to influence child protection policy, legal standards, and public awareness. Pearl Fernandez remains in prison, a convicted murderer, while Gabriel's memory serves as a haunting reminder of the worst kind of maternal betrayal: deliberate, prolonged, and devastatingly cruel. Lacey Spears lived in Syracuse, New York, a woman who at first glance seemed like the doting, attentive mother of a young boy named Garnet Paul Spears. Online, she cultivated an image of devotion, photos of mother and son, posts about parenting, and shared milestones that painted her as every parent's ideal. But behind the carefully curated social media presence, a terrifying reality unfolded, one that would shock the nation and reveal a level of betrayal almost impossible to comprehend. Garnet Paul was only 5 years old, a bright-eyed child who loved cartoons and playing with his friends. To anyone outside the household, he seemed well cared for. Teachers described him as polite, quiet, and affectionate. But over time, strange patterns began to emerge. Garnet Paul was frequently hospitalized for mysterious health issues. Doctors noted severe electrolyte imbalances, including dangerously high levels of sodium in his bloodstream, a condition known as hypernatremia. Despite multiple hospital visits, the cause remained elusive, and the child's symptoms were initially attributed to illness or mismanagement. What investigators later uncovered was chilling. Lacey Spears had deliberately poisoned her son with salt, feeding him excessive amounts that his young body could not handle. She manipulated feeding tubes and carefully measured doses to induce illness without leaving immediate evidence of her actions. Garnet Paul was suffering for years, his mother orchestrating every hospital visit and controlling the narrative to maintain her appearance as a caring parent. Friends and family were oblivious to her actions, convinced that she was merely an overprotective mother, grappling with a child's recurring medical problems. The motive behind Lacey's actions was complex and disturbing. Psychologists later suggested that she exhibited signs of Munchausen by proxy, a mental disorder in which a caregiver deliberately makes a child ill to gain attention, sympathy, or control. Lacey's obsession with social media provided her a platform to broadcast her struggles, presenting herself as a heroic parent navigating constant medical crises. Every hospital visit, every emergency call became material for online validation. In essence, her son became a tool to feed her ego and satisfy her need for attention. The turning point came in July 2014, when Garnet Paul was hospitalized with severe sodium poisoning. He required immediate intensive care, and his condition was critical. Doctors reviewed his medical history and noticed a disturbing pattern. Each previous hospitalization showed similar electrolyte spikes. Suspicion escalated, and Child Protective Services was alerted. Investigators began to closely monitor Lacey, uncovering medical records, social media posts, and witness statements that painted a damning picture. After a thorough investigation, authorities charged Lacey Spears with second-degree murder. Evidence included her repeated administration of lethal sodium doses, manipulations of Garnet Paul's feeding tubes, and communications with medical staff that revealed both knowledge and intent. Emails and posts demonstrated that she was fully aware of the harm she was causing, yet continued to present herself as a loving, concerned mother. During the trial, prosecutors described Lacey as calculating, cold, and manipulative. They presented a timeline showing how she deliberately caused repeated hospitalizations and suffering, documenting her pattern of abuse over several years. Witnesses testified about her behavior in hospitals, where she often appeared calm and composed, while her son's health deteriorated. Friends and family described her obsession with online validation and attention, noting that she seemed more invested in the story she was telling than in her child's actual well-being. The defense attempted to argue that Lacey did not intend to kill her son, and that her actions were misguided attempts at care. They suggested that she may have been mentally unstable or suffering from delusional thinking. However, the extensive evidence of deliberate sodium administration, manipulation of medical records, and repeated hospitalizations left little room for doubt. The prosecution framed the case as an extreme example of maternal betrayal, a mother weaponizing her child's life for personal gain. In February 2015, Lacey Spears was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The judge emphasized the premeditated nature of her actions, the cruelty involved, and the absolute betrayal inherent in a parent deliberately harming their own child. Garnet Paul's death became a focal point for discussions about medical child abuse, the dangers of unchecked parental control, and the psychological mechanisms behind Munchausen by proxy. The case of Lacey Spears serves as a grim reminder that maternal instinct can be twisted into obsession, cruelty, and self-interest. Her story shocked the nation, not only because of the deliberate harm inflicted on a child, but because it exposed the ways in which a mother could manipulate appearances, deceive authorities, and exploit the very system meant to protect her son. Garnet Paul's life, full of potential and innocence, was tragically cut short, his suffering orchestrated by the person entrusted with his care. Today, Lacey Spears remains behind bars, her name synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse in recent memory. Garnet Paul's story continues to influence legal practices, child protection protocols, and public awareness of medical abuse. Experts in psychology and child welfare study the case to understand how such extreme betrayal occurs and how it might be prevented. Her death remains a haunting example of what can happen when love is weaponized and attention becomes more important than life itself. Mary Beth Tinning lived in a small town in upstate New York, a seemingly ordinary mother whose life at first appeared devoted to her children. She married early, had a large family, and projected the image of a nurturing, caring parent. But behind the facade lay one of the most chilling and perplexing cases of maternal betrayal in American history. Between 1972 and 1985, Mary Beth Tinning lost 9 children under suspicious circumstances, a pattern that would eventually lead to her conviction for murder. The first child, a daughter named Mary Ellen, died in 1972 at just a few months old. Doctors initially attributed her death to sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, a diagnosis that would later recur with other children. Over the following years, each child in the Tinning family died young, often under circumstances that seemed natural at first, but later aroused suspicion. Deaths occurred with alarming regularity. After one child's passing, another would follow, often within months. The children were healthy and vibrant, yet each succumbed to sudden, unexplained medical crises. The community and medical professionals were baffled. In the 1970s and early 1980s, knowledge of child abuse and systematic medical neglect was limited. Many of the deaths were initially accepted as tragic accidents. Mary Beth herself presented as a grieving mother, stoic and devastated in public, consoling relatives and friends while processing the inexplicable loss of her children. Her outward grief was convincing, which allowed her to avoid immediate suspicion. However, as the deaths accumulated, patterns emerged. Medical examiners noticed inconsistencies, bruises, unexplained injuries, and unusual circumstances surrounding each death. In some cases, autopsies revealed signs of suffocation or trauma that could not be explained naturally. Forensic experts later argued that the probability of so many children dying from natural causes in the same family was astronomically low. The pattern indicated a mother at the center of the deaths, and Mary Beth Tinning became the primary suspect. Her motives remain the subject of speculation. Some psychologists suggest she may have suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a disorder in which a caregiver deliberately harms a child to gain attention or sympathy. Others propose that she sought emotional validation through the grief of others, orchestrating deaths and presenting herself as a tragic, devoted mother. Whatever the underlying psychological factors, her actions or inactions led to the deaths of 9 children. Nancy, 1973, Joseph, 1974, Stephen, 1975, Edward, 1976, Timothy, 1977, Mark, 1978, Mary Frances, 1980, Susan, 1982, and Julie, 1985. Investigations intensified after the death of Julie, the youngest, in 1985. By this point, authorities were convinced that a pattern of foul play existed. Forensic reviews, witness testimonies, and family statements were combined to build a case against Mary Beth. It became increasingly clear that her repeated losses were not mere accidents. Although she had managed to maintain an image of grief-stricken innocence, experts argued that the deaths were deliberate and, in some cases, possibly premeditated. Mary Beth Tinning was charged with the murder of her 9th child, Julie. The trial, held in the late 1980s, focused on circumstantial evidence and the pattern of previous deaths. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a woman whose maternal role was a cover for sustained and repeated harm. They argued that Mary Beth had systematically caused the deaths of her children, each tragedy reinforcing the illusion of innocence, which, in turn, shielded her from immediate suspicion. Her defense emphasized mental illness, trauma, and emotional instability. They argued that Mary Beth was deeply disturbed, grieving each loss, and perhaps unaware of the true consequences of her actions. Expert witnesses testified to her psychological fragility, suggesting that her behavior was driven by compulsion and emotional disorder, rather than deliberate malevolence. Despite these arguments, the jury was persuaded that Mary Beth's actions went beyond accident or mental fragility. In 1987, she was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of her 9th child, Julie Tinning, and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The judge highlighted the repeated pattern of deaths, the improbability of natural causes across all 9 children, and the deliberate role Mary Beth played in each tragedy. She served 20 years and was released in the early 2000s, but her life remained overshadowed by the horror of what she had done. The Mary Beth Tinning case remains one of the most notorious examples of maternal betrayal in history. It challenged assumptions about motherhood, grief, and trust. To this day, it raises difficult questions. How could a mother take so many lives and maintain the appearance of innocence? How did the system fail to recognize patterns earlier? How can psychology explain the extreme contradiction between maternal role and murderous action? Beyond legal and psychological lessons, the case impacted the way child welfare authorities approach repeated unexplained deaths. Policies on reporting suspicious deaths, evaluating family histories, and monitoring at-risk children were revised to prevent a similar series of tragedies. In many ways, Mary Beth Tinning's actions forced society to reconsider the darkest possibilities of parental betrayal. Mary Beth's story is chilling, not only because of the sheer number of victims, but because it exposes a fundamental breach of trust. Parents are expected to protect, nurture, and guide their children. In Mary Beth Tinning's case, that sacred bond was destroyed repeatedly. 9 children, innocent and trusting, were denied life and safety at the hands of the very person charged with protecting them. Even decades later, the Tinning case remains a subject of study, debate, and sorrow. Mary Beth Tinning's legacy is not one of redemption or understanding, but of warning. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest dangers come from within the walls we consider safest, and that appearances can mask the most horrifying truths. Diane Downs, a 26-year-old mother from Springfield, Oregon, became one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history when she shot her 3 children in May 1983. Her case is remembered not only for the shocking violence, but also for the manipulative lies that followed, illustrating how deceit can magnify a tragedy that should have been straightforward. Diane's story forces us to confront a disturbing question. How could a mother harm her own children so deliberately and then attempt to fabricate a story to avoid responsibility? On the morning of May 19, 1983, Diane Downs drove her children to a remote area near their home. She carried a .44 caliber revolver, which she would use to commit acts so violent and calculated that they would leave lasting psychological scars on the surviving child. Diane shot her 3 children, Christy, Cheryl, and Stephen, in what would initially appear to neighbors and investigators as a horrific attack by an unknown assailant. Christy, age 7, was shot in the head and legs but survived. Cheryl, age 5, was paralyzed from the waist down, and Stephen, age 3, succumbed to his injuries. Diane, presenting herself as the victim, claimed that a hooded stranger had accosted her and her children during a car ride. According to her story, the attacker had pulled a gun, threatened her, and fired indiscriminately, leaving her children gravely wounded. She depicted herself as the heroic mother who tried to save her children from a violent stranger. Initially, the public and even law enforcement were sympathetic. Diane's calm demeanor, combined with tears and dramatic recounting, created a convincing narrative. However, investigators soon noticed inconsistencies. Her accounts of the event did not match the ballistic evidence. The trajectory of the bullets suggested that the shooter had been inside the car with the children, not outside. Witnesses reported seeing Diane in locations and engaging in behaviors that contradicted her timeline. Additionally, Diane's primary motive began to emerge. She was reportedly involved with a man who preferred that she be childless. Killing her children, investigators theorized, would allow her to maintain her romantic relationship without parental obligations. The investigation intensified, with Christie's testimony becoming crucial. Despite the trauma, Christie recalled details that contradicted her mother's story, including seeing Diane holding the gun and firing shots directly at the children. Forensic analysis further reinforced these claims. Blood spatter, bullet angles, and wound patterns all pointed to a single assailant inside the car, Diane herself. When authorities confronted her with the evidence, Diane continued to deny culpability, attempting to manipulate both investigators and public opinion. Her behavior during the investigation was cold and calculated. She maintained her story, sometimes adding dramatic flourishes that seemed more designed to gain sympathy than communicate truth. Experts later described her behavior as classic traits of psychopathy: charm, deceit, and complete lack of empathy for the victims. The trial in 1984 was highly publicized. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: forensic reports, Christie's testimony, and medical records of the children's injuries. Diane's motive, rooted in selfish desire and obsessive attachment to her lover, was laid bare. Her attempts to evade responsibility by portraying herself as a victim were systematically dismantled. Psychologists testified about her manipulative tendencies, narcissistic personality traits, and potential mental health issues that may have contributed to her willingness to harm her children. Diane Downs was ultimately convicted of murder, attempted murder, and assault charges. She received a sentence of life imprisonment plus 50 years. The court emphasized the premeditation, the cold calculation, and the betrayal inherent in a parent shooting her own children. The surviving children, particularly Christy, became living testaments to the horror and resilience of those affected by Diane's actions. Public reaction to the case was intense, Media outlets portrayed Diane as a symbol of maternal evil, a woman whose maternal instincts had been replaced by selfish ambition and psychopathic tendencies. Experts analyzed her personality, parenting style, and previous history, attempting to understand how a mother could transition from care to lethal action. The case has since been featured in numerous documentaries, books, and true crime programs, highlighting its ongoing fascination and horror. Beyond the legal and psychological aspects, the Diane Downs case also changed how Child Protective Services and law enforcement handle parental abuse claims. It underscored the importance of thoroughly investigating injuries inflicted on children, even when the parent presents as cooperative or grieving. The case demonstrated that appearances can be deceiving, and that in some instances, the greatest danger comes from the very person entrusted with a child's safety. Today, Diane Downs remains incarcerated, her life behind bars a stark reminder of the consequences of maternal betrayal. Her surviving children have grown up carrying the physical and emotional scars of that day, their experiences serving as both testimony and cautionary tale. The case continues to be studied in criminology and psychology programs, illustrating the interplay between personality disorders, manipulation, and extreme parental misconduct. The story of Diane Downs is chilling, not only for the violence committed, but for the premeditation, deception, and cold-hearted calculation involved. It forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about parental trust, human psychology, and the fragility of innocence. A mother, a figure synonymous with protection and care, had transformed into a source of unimaginable danger. The Oregon case remains a landmark example of how betrayal can strike closest to home, and how society must remain vigilant when signs of abuse and deception emerge. Megan Huntsman, a mother from Pleasant Grove, Utah, seemed to live a life many might consider ordinary. Married with a family, she attended church, participated in community events, and presented herself as a devoted mother. But beneath the surface lay a shocking pattern of criminal behavior that would make her one of the most notorious cases of maternal betrayal in American history. Over the course of a decade, Megan Huntsman killed 6 of her newborn children, hiding their remains in storage boxes around her property, an act both calculated and horrifying. The story begins in 1996. Megan, married at a young age, gave birth to her first child. Reports later revealed that she had concealed her pregnancies from friends, family, and even her husband in some cases. After delivery, the newborns would disappear, their deaths initially hidden from authorities. In most cases, Megan claimed the babies were stillborn or had been given away, avoiding scrutiny through a combination of secrecy and misdirection. The victims were all infants, some only days old, and all of them female. Over 10 years, the deaths of these children went unnoticed by the broader community. Megan carefully stored the bodies in boxes and containers, keeping them on her property in a way that minimized the chance of discovery. She maintained an outward appearance of normalcy, attending family functions, going to church, and even raising her surviving children without any outward sign of disturbance. The first cracks in this carefully constructed facade appeared in 2006. Authorities began investigating after Megan's son, who had recently discovered the boxes, alerted law enforcement. When officers executed a search, they uncovered 6 boxes containing the remains of infant girls. The discovery stunned not only the local community, but the nation. The children had been hidden meticulously, and forensic analysis suggested that they had died shortly after birth. Megan's actions were deliberate, methodical, and devoid of apparent remorse. During the investigation, it became clear that Megan had acted alone in most cases, without external coercion. She admitted to giving birth in secret and later disposing of the bodies, a pattern that combined elements of neglect, concealment, and extreme denial. Interviews revealed that she often lied about pregnancies to friends and family, claiming to be ill or inventing stories to avoid detection. In some instances, she expressed fear of social stigma and shame, a motive that may explain her secrecy, but not the extreme actions she took. Megan Huntsman's trial began in 2015, nearly a decade after the first killings. Prosecutors painted a picture of a mother who betrayed her maternal role in the most extreme way possible. They argued that the repeated concealment of pregnancies and deliberate disposal of infant bodies demonstrated planning, intent, and cold calculation. They also highlighted the repeated nature of the offenses, emphasizing that this was not a single lapse, but a decade-long pattern of maternal betrayal. The defense sought to contextualize Megan's actions, presenting her as a woman grappling with extreme psychological distress. They argued that she suffered from severe anxiety, depression, and possible postpartum psychosis, which may have influenced her decision-making. Experts testified that she might have been overwhelmed by repeated pregnancies, societal pressures, and personal circumstances, though they did not excuse the fatal outcomes. Despite the defense, the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic examinations of the remains, witness statements, and Megan's own admissions provided a clear timeline of concealment and neglect. The prosecution argued that the repeated nature of the crimes, combined with her meticulous methods of hiding evidence, left no doubt about her culpability. Megan Huntsman ultimately pled guilty to 6 counts of child homicide. She was sentenced to 6 consecutive prison terms of 5 years to life, 1 for each child. A sentence that ensured she would spend the remainder of her life behind bars. During sentencing, the judge emphasized the extraordinary breach of trust, noting that these were acts committed by someone entrusted with life, safety, and care, and that the harm to the surviving family members was profound and enduring. The case shocked the nation for multiple reasons. First, it exposed the terrifying possibility of maternal violence hidden behind years of normalcy and routine. Second, it highlighted systemic limitations, as multiple pregnancies and infant deaths had occurred without raising alarms from healthcare providers or social services, demonstrating how isolation and secrecy can mask extreme abuse. Finally, it forced communities and authorities to reconsider protocols for monitoring at-risk mothers, particularly those with repeated pregnancies outside traditional medical oversight. Megan Huntsman's actions also created lasting trauma for her surviving children. Those who grew up witnessing or discovering the evidence of these deaths were left with emotional scars that experts described as profound and long-lasting. Her case is now frequently cited in studies of neonaticide, maternal filicide, and the psychological profiles of mothers who harm their children, contributing to research on prevention and early intervention. The tragedy of Megan Huntsman lies not only in the lives of 6 infants lost, but in the betrayal of one of society's most fundamental expectations, that a mother will protect her children at all costs. Instead, Megan's secrecy, fear, and deliberate actions ensured that 6 lives ended before they truly began. Her story stands as a chilling reminder that maternal instinct can be perverted, and that vigilance, awareness, and systemic oversight are essential to protect the most vulnerable. Even years later, the story continues to provoke horror and disbelief. Megan Huntsman remains incarcerated, a figure of maternal betrayal whose actions have left a lasting mark on Utah, on her surviving family, and on the national consciousness. Her case is studied not only for its legal implications, but also for the insights it provides into the darkest possibilities of maternal psychology, the limits of social oversight, and the enduring need to protect children from harm within the home. Juanetta Hoyt, a mother from upstate New York, is remembered as one of the most disturbing examples of maternal filicide in American history. Between 1965 and 1971, Juanetta smothered 5 of her own children, exploiting a medical phenomenon that initially helped her avoid detection and leaving a community reeling in disbelief. Her actions reveal the terrifying potential for betrayal when trust, motherhood, and secrecy collide. Juanetta's life on the surface appeared ordinary. She was married, a homemaker, and by all accounts devoted to her family. Friends and neighbors saw a caring mother, attentive to her children's needs. But behind the closed doors of her home, a pattern of tragedy unfolded. Each of her children, ranging in age from infancy to early childhood, died suddenly, often while asleep, and medical professionals at the time attributed these deaths to sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The first death, a baby girl named Sharon in 1965, was devastating for Juanetta, and she presented herself as a grieving mother, stoic and heartbroken. Over the next 6 years, 4 more children died under similar circumstances: Peggy, Brian, Michael, and Terry. Each death was sudden, unexplained, and at first glance medically plausible as a tragic accident. During this period, the phenomenon of SIDS was poorly understood, and infant mortality rates, while declining, still left room for misdiagnoses. Doctors accepted the deaths as unfortunate coincidences, never suspecting that the pattern pointed to deliberate actions by the mother. Community members rallied around Juanetta, offering support and sympathy for the repeated tragedies that had befallen her family. Friends described her as fragile, overwhelmed, and devoted to her remaining children. Her grief appeared genuine, a convincing mask that allowed her to continue her deadly pattern undetected. This combination of tragedy, maternal sorrow, and societal naivety enabled Juanetta to commit her crimes with impunity for several years. It was not until decades later, when modern forensic techniques and investigative persistence allowed authorities to re-examine the deaths, that the shocking truth emerged. In the early 1990s, medical examiners reviewed old case files and noticed patterns inconsistent with natural deaths. All 5 children had similar circumstances, often dying in their sleep with no prior health issues. The clustering of deaths within one family, combined with new scientific understanding of suffocation versus SIDS, led investigators to suspect that the deaths were deliberate. Upon further investigation, Juanetta Hoyt admitted to smothering her children, though her explanations were convoluted and reflected a mixture of remorse and rationalization. She claimed to have been overwhelmed by stress and felt incapable of managing the demands of raising her children. Experts later suggested that Juanetta exhibited traits consistent with Munchausen by proxy and severe personality disturbances, including compulsive control and distorted maternal instincts. In her mind, the deaths may have represented a release of pressure, a way to regain control over a situation she perceived as chaotic and unmanageable. In 1992, Juanetta Hoyt was formally charged with the murder of her 5 children. Her trial became a national sensation, partly because of the historical span of the crimes, the unprecedented number of victims, and the psychological complexity of the case. The prosecution argued that the repeated deaths could not reasonably be considered accidents, and that Juanetta had deliberately suffocated her children in their sleep. They emphasized the premeditation inherent in repeated, similar acts over several years, highlighting the breach of maternal trust that made the crimes especially horrifying. Her defense centered on mental illness, arguing that Juanetta was not fully aware of the consequences of her actions and had been psychologically overwhelmed. Expert witnesses testified about her possible compulsion, anxiety, and emotional fragility. While these factors provided context, they could not absolve her of responsibility, particularly given the repeated nature of the crimes. Juanetta Hoyt was convicted in 1994 of second-degree murder for each child. She was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, reflecting the cumulative severity of the 5 deaths and the premeditated nature of her actions. The court recognized the extraordinary breach of trust, noting that a mother is expected to protect her children, not intentionally end their lives. The Hoyt case drew attention to systemic failures in medical diagnosis and social oversight. At the time of the deaths, SIDS was poorly understood, and no one questioned the improbability of 5 deaths occurring in one household. The case underscored the importance of rigorous investigation in multiple child deaths, even when natural causes appear plausible, and it has informed modern child protection policies and forensic protocols. Juanetta Hoyt's actions were a profound violation of societal and familial trust. 5 children, innocent and defenseless, were taken from life by the very person who should have safeguarded them. The emotional impact on surviving family members and the broader community was immense, leaving lasting trauma and a deep sense of betrayal. Psychologists and criminologists studied the case to understand how maternal instincts can be twisted into fatal actions, particularly under stress and in combination with psychological disorders. Even today, Juanetta Hoyt remains a chilling example of maternal filicide, a case where appearances of normalcy and grief concealed a devastating reality. Her story reminds us that even those who seem devoted, caring, and overwhelmed by circumstance can harbor the potential for unimaginable harm. The combination of secrecy, psychological disturbance, and repeated action made her one of the most notorious mothers in American history. Her legacy, a stark warning about the extremes of maternal betrayal. Dee Blanchard, a seemingly devoted mother from Springfield, Missouri, became a central figure in one of the most shocking and widely discussed cases of maternal abuse in recent American history. Unlike other cases of direct filicide, Dee Dee's betrayal took the insidious form of Munchausen by proxy, a condition in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a dependent to gain attention, sympathy, or control. In Dee Dee's case, her daughter, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, suffered years of abuse, manipulation, and confinement that would eventually culminate in Dee Dee's murder at the hands of her daughter's boyfriend in 2015. Dee Dee Blanchard's life, as presented to outsiders, seemed to be the picture of maternal dedication. She appeared to care for Gypsy Rose with extreme devotion, taking her to countless doctor visits, encouraging her to use wheelchairs, feeding tubes, and medications for conditions she did not have. Dee Dee fabricated a litany of illnesses for Gypsy Rose: leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, and developmental disorders, ensuring that everyone in their community, neighbors, relatives, and even charitable organizations viewed Gypsy Rose as chronically ill. The family benefited materially as well. Dee Dee received free trips, donations, and public attention, cultivating an image of heroism and sacrifice that obscured the reality of her abuse. Gypsy Rose, in reality, was a healthy young woman. Dee Dee's manipulation extended to every aspect of her life. She prevented Gypsy from attending school regularly, controlled her social interactions, and monitored communications to prevent anyone from discovering the truth. Gypsy's independence was systematically stripped away under the guise of medical necessity, leaving her isolated and trapped in a world defined by her mother's lies. The abuse was psychological, emotional, and coercive, creating an environment where escape seemed impossible. The dynamic between Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose was complex. While Dee Dee exerted near total control, Gypsy was intelligent, resourceful, and increasingly aware of the deception surrounding her. Over time, resentment, fear, and a desire for freedom grew within her. The psychological pressure became unbearable, and Gypsy sought a way to escape the constant domination of her mother. This culminated in her relationship with Nicholas Godejohn, a man she met online, who would ultimately assist her in planning Dee Dee's death. On June 14, 2015, Dee Dee Blanchard was found murdered in her home. She had been stabbed multiple times, and the crime scene suggested planning and intent. Investigators quickly focused on Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn. It soon emerged that Gypsy had conspired with Nicholas to kill Dee Dee, viewing it as her only viable escape from years of abuse. The details of the crime shocked the nation, not only because a daughter had killed her mother, but because of the prolonged, systemic abuse that had led to the act. The trial revealed the depth of Dee Dee's deception. Witnesses and experts testified about the years of fabricated illnesses, unnecessary medical procedures, and psychological manipulation. Doctors and child welfare specialists confirmed that Gypsy had been forced to endure treatments she did not need, reinforcing the narrative of maternal abuse for the mother's gain. The legal focus shifted from the act of murder itself to understanding the circumstances that made Gypsy feel trapped and powerless. Nicholas Godejohn was tried and convicted of first-degree murder, receiving a life sentence without parole, as he carried out the physical act of killing Dee Dee. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was charged as an accomplice, but ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, receiving a 10-year prison sentence. The court recognized the mitigating factors of years of abuse, coercion, and psychological control, emphasizing that Gypsy's actions were influenced by prolonged victimization. The case of Dee Dee Blanchard has had a profound impact on public awareness of Munchausen by proxy, parental abuse, and the dynamics of coercive control. Media coverage, documentaries, and true crime programs have explored the story extensively, often portraying Gypsy Rose as both a victim and a reluctant perpetrator. Psychologists note that cases like this illustrate the complex interplay between victimization and agency, highlighting how extreme abuse can drive individuals to desperate measures for survival. Dee Dee's abuse extended beyond physical health. It was totalitarian, controlling, and relentless. She dictated Gypsy's clothing, mobility, and social interactions, creating a life of isolation and fear. Charitable organizations, neighbors, and even physicians were deceived by her performance, illustrating how sophisticated and manipulative her abuse had become. Gypsy Rose's eventual actions, while legally criminal, are widely interpreted as a response to decades of entrapment and psychological manipulation. Even after the legal proceedings, the story remains a cautionary tale about the unseen dangers of parental abuse. Munchausen by proxy is difficult to detect, and Dee Dee Blanchard's case illustrates how abuse can thrive when authority figures, medical professionals, and the public fail to question appearances. It also raises ethical questions about culpability, victimhood, and justice when the perpetrator of abuse is killed by someone they controlled for years. Dee Dee Blanchard's story is remembered not only for the murder that ended her life, but for the elaborate web of lies, medical manipulation, and psychological control she wove over nearly 2 decades. Gypsy Rose, once a figure of helplessness, eventually became a symbol of survival, resilience, and the complex moral questions that arise in extreme cases of parental abuse. The legacy of this case continues to educate the public, inform child welfare policies, and underscore the importance of vigilance when signs of coercion and medical deception are present. Ultimately, Dee Dee Blanchard's life and death serve as a grim reminder of the capacity for betrayal within familial relationships, the perils of unchecked maternal control, and the ways in which abuse can create circumstances where escape becomes a matter of survival, even when it requires breaking the law. The story continues to captivate, horrify, and educate, ensuring that the lessons learned from her crimes and their consequences will not be forgotten.